The first notice arrived on a bright afternoon, thin paper carrying a threat far bigger than it looked. The HOA wanted my antenna lowered, trimmed, made invisible. They claimed it ruined the neighborhood image. What they didn't realize was that this antenna quietly held the entire block together. As fines piled up and pressure mounted, something unexpected happened. Phones went dead. Signals vanished. Panic spread faster than blame. And suddenly, the person who tried to control my property was begging for help. How did a petty HOA rule turn into total neighborhood silence? Before any letters showed up or rules were suddenly enforced, life in the neighborhood was predictable in the best way. The kind of place where mornings felt quiet and evenings settled into routine without effort. I had moved there for that reason. Clean streets, modest homes, trimmed lawns, and a sense that nothing ever really happened. It wasn't exciting, but it was stable, and after years of noise and unpredictability elsewhere, that stability mattered. My house sat near the edge of the development, close enough to the main road to feel connected but far enough in that traffic noise faded into the background. The backyard sloped gently upward, giving me a clear line of sight over the rooftops behind me. That mattered more than anyone realized at the time. I worked remotely in a field that depended on constant connectivity. Redundancy wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Power outages, service interruptions, and dropped signals weren't inconveniences. They were threats to my livelihood. That was why the antenna went up. It wasn't massive. It wasn't flashing. It didn't spin or hum or glow at night. It was a slim, functional structure, mounted carefully, painted to blend in, and placed where it would do its job without drawing attention. Most people didn't even notice it unless they were looking for it. To me, it was peace of mind. To the neighborhood, it was invisible. At least at first. The HOA had always existed in the background like a quiet manager you rarely interacted with unless something went wrong. Dues were paid on time. Lawns were maintained. Trash cans disappeared from the curb on schedule. I followed the rules because they were reasonable, and because compliance kept life simple. The association newsletters were easy to ignore, filled with reminders about seasonal decorations and approved paint colors. Nothing threatening. Nothing personal. But the HOA leadership changed. New faces appeared on the board. New energy. New priorities. Suddenly, the newsletters grew longer, more detailed, and more critical. Words like community standards and visual harmony appeared more often. Small things became big things. Grass length. Fence materials. The angle of parked vehicles and driveways. It felt like a shift from maintenance to control, subtle enough that most people shrugged it off. I noticed the antenna being mentioned in passing long before it became a problem. A vague reference in a monthly update about unapproved exterior structures. A reminder that architectural elements should be reviewed. Nothing addressed directly to me. Nothing specific enough to demand action. It was easy to assume it was meant for someone else. After all, the antenna had been there for a while. Neighbors still waved. Delivery drivers still found my house. Internet speed stayed strong. Cell service across the block was reliable, even during storms when nearby areas went dark. I took quiet satisfaction in knowing that my setup wasn't just helping me. It was stabilizing something larger. The network load balanced better. Dead zones disappeared. Emergency calls went through without delay. None of that was advertised and no one asked questions. That anonymity wouldn't last. As the HOA's focus sharpened, so did its attention. Notices began appearing on doors throughout the neighborhood. Friendly reminders, they called them. Gentle nudges toward compliance. The kind that carried an unspoken warning beneath the politeness. I watched neighbors grumble, make changes, and move on. A trimmed hedge here. A repainted shutter there. Small sacrifices for quiet living. Then I received my first envelope. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even accusatory. It simply stated that a review of exterior modifications was underway and that certain installations might need adjustment to align with updated guidelines. No deadlines. No fines. Just a suggestion, wrapped in formal language, that something on my property was suddenly out of bounds. I looked up at the antenna from the driveway that evening and felt the first real tension tighten in my chest. It hadn't changed. I hadn't changed. But the rules had, quietly and without warning. What had once been acceptable was now questionable, and the people asking questions weren't interested in understanding why it existed. They were interested in how it looked. The neighborhood still appeared calm on the surface, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was a sense that scrutiny was increasing, that someone was always watching for something out of place. The antenna, once unnoticed, now felt exposed. Not because it was wrong, but because it was different. And in a place obsessed with uniformity, different was dangerous. What no one realized yet was how deeply connected that small structure was to everything around it, how fragile the balance really was, and how quickly a cosmetic complaint could unravel an entire system that everyone took for granted. What followed that first envelope wasn't sudden. It was methodical, deliberate, and exhausting in a way only bureaucratic pressure can be. Weeks passed, then another letter arrived. This one was firmer. The antenna was now listed as a non-conforming exterior structure, under a newly clarified guideline. The language was careful, almost polite, but the implication was clear. Compliance was expected. Resistance would be documented. I reread the letter more times than I should have. There was no accusation of harm, no claim of interference, no safety concern. Only aesthetics. Height. Visibility. The idea that something functional, something quiet and essential, was suddenly a visual offense. It felt arbitrary, like the rule had been written backward to justify a decision already made. I submitted documentation. Photos. Measurements. Proof that the installation predated the updated rules. Evidence that it met federal protections most homeowners never think about. The response came back colder than before. Those protections, the HOA claimed, didn't apply the way I thought they did. They cited interpretations, not laws. Opinions, not precedents. And with each exchange, the tone shifted from cooperative to confrontational. A deadline appeared. Lower the antenna to a specified height or face penalties. Daily penalties. Accruing penalties. I stood in my yard one evening watching the sun dip below the rooftops, and felt something tighten behind my ribs. Lowering the antenna wasn't a minor adjustment. It would cripple the system. Signal strength would drop. Coverage would fracture. Redundancy would vanish. What the HOA framed as a cosmetic tweak was, in reality, dismantling infrastructure. The fines began quietly. A modest amount at first, small enough to feel insulting rather than threatening. A nudge. A reminder that the clock was ticking. I refused to pay them on principle, which only accelerated the process. The next notice listed accumulated fees, administrative charges, and the possibility of further action if the violation remained unresolved. Around that time, subtle changes started happening in the neighborhood. Connectivity issues surfaced, scattered and inconsistent. A dropped call here. A buffering screen there. Nothing dramatic enough to cause alarm, but enough to raise eyebrows. I noticed delivery drivers lingering longer at the curb, phones held up, waiting for bars to reappear. I noticed neighbors stepping outside to finish calls. I noticed emergency alerts arriving late, then not at all. The HOA, however, didn't notice any of that. Or if they did, they didn't connect it to the antenna they were so eager to shrink. Inspections increased. Someone drove past my house more often than necessary. Photos were taken from the street. Notes were added to my file. The antenna became a symbol, not of function, but of defiance. It represented a homeowner who hadn't fallen in line. And that couldn't be tolerated. Another letter arrived, heavier this time. Certified. It warned of enforced compliance. Of the HOA's right to enter my property to correct the violation if I failed to act. Of billing me for the cost. Of liens. Of consequences far out of proportion to the alleged offense. I felt anger then, sharp and focused. Not just at the HOA but at the absurdity of it all. The imbalance of power. The way a small group of volunteers, armed with vague rules and confidence, could threaten someone's livelihood over something so trivial on the surface. I pushed back harder. I requested hearings. Filed appeals. Submitted more documentation. I pointed out inconsistencies in enforcement. Other structures that exceeded height limits. Other modifications that went unchallenged. The response was always the same. Those cases were different. Those homeowners had approvals. Those situations didn't apply. The fines grew. And then the service issues stopped being subtle. One morning, an entire stretch of the block lost cell service for nearly an hour. Not completely dead, but unusable. Calls failed. Messages stalled. Apps spun endlessly. People stepped outside, phones raised, searching for signal like it might fall from the sky. By the time service returned, frustration had already settled in. That afternoon, another notice appeared on my door. The timing wasn't lost on me. The HOA framed the outage as irrelevant, coincidental, unrelated. They insisted the antenna had nothing to do with it, even as they demanded it be altered. Their logic twisted in on itself, but they didn't care. They had authority. They had momentum. And they had decided this was the hill they would stand on. Pressure mounted from unexpected angles. Neighbors who had once been friendly grew distant. Not hostile but cautious. The kind of distance that comes from not wanting to be associated with conflict. Rumors circulated. Afterwards, the antenna was dangerous, was illegal, it was causing problems. The HOA didn't correct any of it. I watched the community's perception shift, slowly but unmistakably. What had been an invisible structure became a focal point for anxiety, even as the real source of disruption remained hidden behind official letterhead. Another outage hit during a storm. This one lasted longer. Emergency services struggled to get through. A neighbor's medical alert device failed to connect. Panic rippled outward, brief but intense. When service finally returned, the relief was mixed with confusion. How could something so basic be so fragile? The HOA responded by doubling down. A final notice was issued. This one set a date. The time. If the antenna wasn't lowered by then, action would be taken. No more discussion. No more appeals. Just enforcement. I realized then that this wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control. About proving that resistance was futile. That the HOA's vision of uniformity mattered more than function, more than safety, more than sense. Behind the scenes, I prepared. I documented everything. Timelines. Notices. Outages. Correlations that were impossible to ignore if someone bothered to look. I consulted experts, not lawyers yet, but people who understood infrastructure, who understood how fragile systems become when redundancy is removed. Their assessments were clear. Lowering the antenna would degrade service across the area. Not immediately catastrophic, but progressively worse. Especially under load. The deadline loomed. As it approached, the outages became more frequent. Shorter, sharper, like warning tremors before something larger. The HOA's office phones began dropping calls. Emails bounced back undelivered. Online portals timed out. The very systems they relied on to enforce their authority started failing them. Still, they didn't stop. On the morning of the deadline, I woke to a neighborhood already tense. People stood in driveways, phones in hand, frustration written across their faces. The signal was weak, unstable. Social media posts complained about service providers. Support lines were jammed. No one looked toward the antenna, but everyone felt its absence. By midday, the HOA sent one last message, insisting that enforcement would proceed as planned. That was when the silence hit. Not just dropped calls or slow data. Complete loss. Phones became inert slabs of glass. Wi-Fi struggled, then failed as backhaul connections collapsed under the strain. Businesses nearby closed early. Parents couldn't reach schools. Navigation apps froze mid-route. Panic replaced irritation. And in that moment, as the neighborhood collectively realized how dependent it had become on something it had tried to erase, the HOA finally noticed the connection they had spent weeks denying. But by then it was too late to quietly walk it back. The system was already unraveling, and the people who had pushed it there were about to face consequences they never anticipated. By the time the HOA realized what was happening, the damage was no longer theoretical. It was visible, measurable, and unfolding in real time. The neighborhood had crossed from inconvenience into crisis, and there was no polite way to pretend otherwise. The enforcement crew arrived first. Not contractors yet, just representatives with clipboards and authority, standing in my driveway and staring upward as if the antenna had personally insulted them. They expected resistance. What they didn't expect was how calm everything felt on my end. The system was already strained to its limit. Redundancy had been throttled. Load balancing was failing. One more disruption, one more forced adjustment, and the entire network backbone feeding the area would collapse completely. At the same time, the HOA office was unraveling. Their phones were unusable. Their cloud-based management software wouldn't load. Digital records were inaccessible. Payment portals failed. They couldn't even reliably email one another. The same silence gripping the neighborhood had swallowed them whole, and for the first time, they were trapped inside the consequences of their own decisions. The wider impact spread quickly. Nearby businesses lost connectivity and shut their doors. Security systems defaulted into fail-safe modes. Traffic backed up as navigation apps stopped updating. Emergency response times slowed as dispatch struggled with unstable connections. What had been dismissed as a cosmetic issue was now unmistakably a public safety problem. That was when the regulatory oversight arrived. Not summoned by the HOA, but triggered automatically by network monitoring systems that flagged a sudden, severe degradation across a defined service area. Engineers traced the issue within hours. They didn't look at lawns or fences or community standards. They looked at infrastructure. At coverage maps. At interference patterns. at the abrupt removal of vertical clearance that had once stabilized the entire region. The conclusion was immediate and damning. The antenna was not a violation. It was a mitigation. It had been compensating for weak coverage caused by terrain, construction density, and outdated carrier equipment. It had been quietly preventing exactly the kind of failure now paralyzing the neighborhood. And the HOA's attempt to alter it without understanding its role had directly triggered the collapse. Documentation changed hands rapidly. Timelines lined up with brutal precision. Notices, fines, enforcement dates, and outage logs formed a single, undeniable narrative. The HOA's internal communications, frozen mid-transmission by their own lack of service, painted an even uglier picture. They hadn't just ignored warnings. They had overridden them. The power dynamic flipped in an instant. What had been a homeowner under threat was now a community asset wrongfully targeted. What had been an HOA asserting authority was now an organization facing scrutiny for overreach, negligence, and interference with protected infrastructure. Their rules, once wielded like weapons, suddenly looked flimsy and reckless under external review. The enforcement action was halted before it could physically touch the antenna. Orders were issued. Cease and desist notices landed with far more weight than any HOA letter ever had. Liability was discussed. Insurance carriers were notified. The word exposure entered conversations that had previously revolved around aesthetics. The neighborhood, still largely offline, felt the tension even without understanding the details. People gathered outside, no longer angry at random service providers, but at the situation itself. The realization crept in that something essential had been threatened not by accident, but by pride. When connectivity was partially restored through emergency rerouting, the truth spread quickly. Not through official announcements, but through pieced-together explanations, shared screenshots, and the unmistakable pattern of cause and effect. The antenna everyone had been told was a problem had been the solution all along. The HOA's authority evaporated in that moment. Meetings were postponed indefinitely due to technical failures. Board members stopped appearing in public. The confidence that had fueled months of aggressive enforcement collapsed under the weight of accountability. Their attempt to assert control had exposed how little control they actually had. Standing in my yard that evening, watching signal strength stabilize as systems came back online, I felt no triumph. Only a quiet, heavy vindication. The kind that comes not from winning, but from being proven right when the cost of being wrong was borne by everyone else. The antenna stood unchanged against the darkening sky. And the people who tried to erase it were about to learn that some structures, once attacked, bring everything else down with them. The restoration didn't happen all at once. Connectivity returned in layers, uneven and cautious, as if the systems themselves no longer trusted the ground they were standing on. First came emergency rerouting, temporary fixes meant to stop the bleeding. Then permanent adjustments, carefully planned and externally supervised. Through it all, the antenna remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and unquestioned. The HOA, on the other hand, changed overnight. Within days, official notices replaced threats. The tone shifted from authoritative to apologetic without ever fully admitting fault. Enforcement actions were suspended across the neighborhood, not just related to my property but everywhere. Fines were frozen. Liens quietly withdrawn. Letters once sent with confidence were now rewritten with legal caution, scrubbed of certainty and filled with vague reassurances. An independent review was announced. It wasn't framed as an investigation, but everyone understood what it was. The HOA's decisions, procedures, and authority were suddenly under a microscope. External consultants evaluated how rules had been interpreted, how enforcement had been prioritized, and how something as critical as infrastructure had been dismissed as decoration. The findings didn't circulate publicly, but their effects were impossible to miss. Board members resigned one by one. Some cited personal reasons. Others simply disappeared from the association's communications. Meetings were postponed repeatedly, then restructured entirely. New leadership was brought in on an interim basis, instructed to do one thing above all else: stabilize the community and stay out of the way. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though it was a different kind of normal than before. People spoke more openly. About the outages. About the fines they'd quietly paid for minor infractions. About the unease they'd felt watching enforcement ramp up over things that never seemed to matter until someone decided they did. The antenna became a reference point, not as an eyesore but as a reminder. A physical marker of how close the community had come to breaking itself over appearances. I received formal confirmation that the structure was fully compliant, not just under federal protections, but under revised HOA guidelines that suddenly emphasized functionality, safety, and due process. The document was thorough, careful to leave no ambiguity. It wasn't a favor. It was an acknowledgement that the HOA no longer had the authority to interfere. Financially, the outcome was decisive. All fines were voided. Administrative fees refunded. Legal expenses incurred during the escalation were reimbursed through the association's insurance, quietly and without ceremony. The threat of liens vanished as if it had never existed. But the real impact wasn't financial. Trust, once eroded, doesn't snap back into place. Neighbors who had distanced themselves returned slowly, cautiously. Some apologized without words, through gestures and glances that carried weight precisely because nothing was said. Others asked questions they hadn't felt safe asking before. About the antenna. About the outages. About how something so essential could have been targeted so aggressively. The answer was always the same. It wasn't malice. It was ignorance paired with authority. A dangerous combination. The HOA's new leadership adopted a drastically different posture. Rules were simplified. Enforcement was scaled back. Reviews were required before any action could be taken against structures or modifications. Experts were consulted instead of ignored. The association shifted from policing to maintaining, from control to stewardship. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was better. Beyond the neighborhood, the incident left ripples. Service providers updated their coverage models. Redundancy planning was revised. Monitoring systems were adjusted to flag not just outages, but the administrative actions that could cause them. Quiet changes, invisible to most, but significant enough to prevent the same mistake from happening again somewhere else. As for me, life returned to its rhythm, though I noticed it more now. The quiet hum of stable connectivity. The absence of dropped calls. The way emergency alerts arrived on time, every time. Things that had once been background noise now felt like privileges earned through vigilance. I didn't celebrate the HOA's collapse. There was no satisfaction in watching people lose positions or reputations. But there was relief. Relief that restraint had prevailed where ego had failed. Relief that the system had corrected itself before the cost became irreversible. The antenna remained what it had always been, a tool, a safeguard, a piece of infrastructure doing its job without asking for recognition. It hadn't won a battle. It had simply been allowed to exist. The experience changed how I viewed communities like this. HOAs thrive on the assumption that small powers are harmless. That rules about paint colors and fence heights can never escalate into something truly damaging. But when authority goes unchecked, when appearance outweighs function, even the smallest rule can become a lever capable of breaking something vital. The neighborhood learned that lesson the hard way. People became more attentive to board elections, more engaged in meetings, less willing to dismiss minor disputes as not worth the trouble. There was a collective understanding now that silence enables overreach, and that compliance without comprehension can be just as dangerous as open defiance. Months later, when storms rolled through and nearby areas went dark, the neighborhood stayed connected. Phones rang. Messages sent. Emergency services responded without delay. The system held, quiet and resilient, exactly as it was designed to. Sometimes I'd catch someone glancing up at the antenna, not with suspicion, but with something closer to respect. Not because it stood tall, but because it had endured. The story spread beyond the block, then beyond the development. Not as gossip, but as caution. A reminder shared in online forums and community groups, stripped of names but heavy with implication. HOAs read it and recognized themselves in it, whether they admitted it or not. Because the truth is uncomfortable. Power exercised without understanding doesn't just inconvenience people. It destabilizes systems. It punishes function in favor of form. And when challenged, it often doubles down, unaware that the ground beneath it is already cracking. This wasn't a story about winning against an HOA. It was about what happens when authority forgets its purpose. When rules become weapons. When silence is mistaken for consent. In the end, nothing dramatic remained. No courtrooms. No headlines. Just a neighborhood that learned, painfully and publicly, that some things exist for reasons deeper than appearances. And a simple question lingered, unspoken but impossible to ignore. How many other communities are one petty rule away from breaking something they never realized was holding them together?